Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Savannah. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In late autumn of 1865, Savannah lay hushed, its streets marked by the scars of war. The winds off the river carried chill dampness, and the city's pastel antebellum facades seemed to sag beneath a veil of uncertainty. Just months earlier, General Sherman had completed his infamous march to the sea, sweeping through Georgia and capturing Savannah in December 1864. That campaign had left deep scars in the region and reshaped civil life in the state. Wikipedia +1 It was into this fragile, unsettled world that the Miller sisters arrived. Emma, Catherine, and Lillian. They came to claim a modest plot of land just beyond the city's eastern outskirts, where the tangle of marshes and hidden ditches blurred the boundary between cultivated ground and wilderness. Neighbors muttered of the property's prior owners, an aging widower who vanished one winter, then a daughter who died under murky circumstances. But the sisters insisted all claims had been resolved. From the start, their presence seemed out of quiet sync with the surroundings. Their carriage rolled in just as dusk settled on a November evening, rattling over uneven boards. The driver noted in his ledger that the sisters looked pale, rigid, and barely spoke as they descended. Their dresses, dark and stiff, were ill-suited for the damp air, and the faces of the sisters bore an almost marble calm, as though they had rehearsed their arrival. They took up residence in the old manor that stood on the lot, a low brick house with shuttered windows and a long porch. The neighbors soon saw candlelights moving at odd hours. One housekeeper, Abigail Crow, later wrote in her diary, "I heard soft footsteps upstairs well past midnight, though all doors were locked." Another local, cotton farmer, Jacob Reeves, swore he glimpsed silhouettes at windows, even when no one should have been within view. By Christmas, rumors began to swirl. Livestock near the property would vanish, or be found drained of strength. Children passing by claimed they heard soft sobbing inside, when no one was known to be home. In February 1866, Reverend Thomas Barlow of a nearby parish visited the sisters to offer church services. He recorded in his sermon register that he saw one of them weep briefly and then become rigid, staring at the ceiling as though addressing someone invisible. Midway through their first year in Savannah, local journalists made passing note of odd entries in probate courts, former owners' wills reopened, small parcels of land quietly transferred, names altered or suppressed. One clerk in Chatham County remembered writing in 1867 about a petition to seal certain deeds, marked at petitioner's request. The county historian, relying partly on Georgia in the American Civil War archives and local court rolls, later speculated these maneuvers were meant to hide connections to earlier disappearances. As 1866 deepened into a languid Savannah spring, the Miller sisters' home became a quiet point of fascination for those who passed along the river road. The vegetation reclaimed the path leading to their porch, vines crept along the banisters, and pale moss dripped from the eaves. The few who dared visit described a stillness that felt unnatural, as though even the cicadas withheld their chorus near the property. According to fragments of Georgia in the American Civil War records, Savannah at that time was struggling to rebuild its civic order. Union forces maintained a presence in the city, and many freed families had begun resettling the marshlands to the east. Among the Reconstruction-era reports preserved in the Chatham County Register were notes of a household of peculiar ladies who received regular deliveries of chemical supplies, small glass vials, chalk, saltpeter, and dried herbs. The receipts bore the name Miss C. Miller in careful penmanship. By midsummer, whispers of strange behavior circulated through the parishes. A delivery boy, young Caleb Timmons, later testified that when he left parcels at their door, a faint humming came from within, rhythmic, low, and measured, like someone reading prayers backward. On one occasion, he claimed to see a hand mark upon the glass from inside, though no one answered his knock. When a neighbor, Mrs. Langford, fell ill after visiting, townsfolk drew uneasy connections. "She had gone to deliver a loaf and came home pale as a sheet," her husband said. "Couldn't bear sunlight for 3 days after." The local physician, Dr. Elias Porter, dismissed such talk as superstition. noting only that Savannah's air remained thick with post-war sickness, yellow fever, malarial fevers, and malnutrition. Still, he admitted the sisters' habits were reclusive, bordering upon the uncanny. One newspaper clipping from the Savannah Republican, dated September 1866, reported an incident near their property. Unusual lights were seen over the marsh, bluish in hue, moving in strange patterns before dawn. Some credited it to swamp gas, others whispered of the sisters' experiments. It was said they studied anatomy and spiritism alike, drawing inspiration from foreign journals. Their late-night carriage trips to the old medical college were noted by a stable hand, who swore the horses trembled at the sight of their veiled faces. During one rain-soaked evening, Reverend Barlow returned for a pastoral call. His surviving notebook describes what he found. The parlor was empty but warm, the hearth aflame though no one attended it. On the mantel, 3 silver spoons arranged in a perfect triangle, and the faint scent of ether hung in the air. He claimed he heard soft tapping upstairs, precise, patterned almost like Morse, yet the sisters later insisted they had all been asleep. By the year's end, several small disappearances troubled the district: a house servant, 2 dock workers, and a union surveyor who had last been seen near the Miller property. The constable's log for 1867 simply reads, "Inquiry made, nothing found." The war had taught Savannah to live with gaps in its record, but this silence felt deliberate. By 1867, Savannah's marshes had turned heavy with midsummer heat. The air shimmered over stagnant pools, and the gnats hovered thick as smoke. The Miller house, once dismissed as curiosity, now inspired unease among townsfolk. Local men avoided the trail after dusk, and even the ferrymen crossing the Wilmington River refused to row near the bank below the property. In March, the Savannah Morning News printed a peculiar notice: "Estate inquiry pending, Miller family holdings subject to review." The report named no relatives, yet city records from the same month listed the sisters as heirs to a former physician, Dr. Alaric Wayne, who had perished in the 1850s during a fever outbreak. Cross-referencing details later preserved in the Georgia, in the American Civil War archives. Historians inferred that Wayne's modest practice once supplied Confederate hospitals with experimental tonics and anatomical specimens. When word spread that his instruments might still be stored in the Miller residence, curiosity turned to dread. A blacksmith named Samuel Creel claimed he had been summoned there to repair a broken hinge. In his affidavit, he described the interior as strange and sweetly foul. There was a low table with glass jars upon it, he said. What I took for preserved fruit was something else entirely. He never elaborated further and left Savannah within the week. From that spring onward, the sisters became nearly invisible by daylight. Only at twilight would faint lamplight glow through the shutters, moving slowly from room to room. A postmaster, one Mr. Reuben Nash, recorded in his notes that letters addressed to E.M. arrived regularly from Charleston and New York, bearing unfamiliar seals, one embossed with a coiled serpent, another with a symbol resembling a medical caduceus crossed by a key. Nash admitted curiosity, but said there was a feeling one ought not pry. Reverend Barlow, by then increasingly disturbed by his own recollections, consulted Dr. Porter again. Together they resolved to visit the house under pretense of a welfare check. His later testimony, dated June 4, 1867, describes their arrival. The house was silent, curtains drawn tight as bandages. The door yielded at last to a push, revealing dust thick on the floorboards save for 3 sets of footprints, each circling a central rug where a stain the size of a basin had dried dark. Upstairs, the doctor found pages of anatomical sketches, nerves, tendons, faces partially erased. Several were annotated in precise foreign script. Among them was a list of measurements beside a note. The boundary between thought and flesh is no thicker than the membrane between breaths. Dr. Porter's handwriting faltered mid-sentence in his own report, as though his hand had trembled. That autumn, one of the sisters, and believed to be Emma, ceased appearing altogether. When asked, Catherine replied softly that in the spring of 1868, the air around Savannah grew heavy again, not just from the mists that hung over the river, but from suspicion. Those who remembered the war said the silence of the Miller property reminded them of the days after the city's surrender. Still, tense, waiting for something unnamed to break, the local sheriff, Amos Crittenden, finally authorized a discreet inquiry. He had received letters from 2 separate parishes, both describing missing persons last seen near the sisters' land. Crittenden was a cautious man, a veteran of the 1st Georgia Infantry, familiar with the superstitions that haunted Reconstruction. He took 3 men and entered the property one early morning in May. The constable's report, preserved later among Chatham County archives, described the scene as unearthly quiet. The odor of ether mixed with earth and oil. Inside, dust lay thick, yet certain things gleamed with unsettling freshness. Glass beakers, surgical scissors, and small mirrors stacked on a tray. A medical trunk marked AW sat open by the fireplace, likely a relic of Dr. Alaric Wayne, the Confederate physician previously mentioned in the Georgia in the American Civil War entries. Among the contents were scalpels wrapped in linen and an unlabeled vial containing a clear, viscous liquid. Upstairs, in a back chamber, they found a makeshift laboratory. 3 chairs faced a central table upon which rested a brass contraption, its purpose unclear. Beneath it lay sheets filled with anatomical notes and sketches of nervous systems. Written beside them in a slanted feminine hand were phrases like retention of soul impulse and tissue response to invocation. Sheriff Crittenden, though shaken, recorded only what he could prove. He sealed the trunk, posted a guard, and ordered the sisters to appear before the court. But when the deputies returned the following day, the house was empty. No luggage, no horses, no tracks leading to the road, only the faint smell of burning resin and, as one deputy later insisted, a soft hum as if the air itself remembered their voices. Over the months that followed, scattered sightings emerged. A washerwoman in Charleston swore she saw 2 women matching their description boarding a coastal steamer. A telegraph operator in Augusta mentioned receiving a message signed EM, asking for supplies, same as before. None of these accounts could be verified. By the early 1870s, the manor had already begun to rot. Ivy tore through the shutters, and the floorboards warped with humidity. A later inventory taken by a Union medical officer found remnants of equipment consistent with experimental anatomy work. He concluded, the household of the Miller women engaged in pursuits beyond their learning or license. And yet, among Savannah's quieter circles, whispers persisted that one sister, the youngest, Lillian, remained nearby. Some said she lived under another name as a governess on the outskirts of town, others that she wandered the riverbanks at dusk, murmuring to herself in French or Latin. None could say for sure. But by then no one wanted to. By 1872, the name Miller had faded from public documents. Yet whispers persisted in Savannah's old quarters. Those who had once gossiped openly now lowered their voices, as if the name itself carried contagion. Even in the coastal counties, fishermen swore the marsh fog near the sisters' property moved with a will of its own. A new owner, a merchant named Julius Carr, purchased the abandoned house that same year. His diary, later donated to the Georgia Historical Society, recounts his first impressions. The air inside was cool and dry, though the day was hot. A faint humming like a telegraph's pulse came from somewhere below the floor. When he pried up a warped board, he found a small chamber lined with bricks, an unfinished cellar filled with jars, bones, and what he called a scent of something not yet dead. Carr wrote to a physician in town, requesting an inspection. The man, Dr. Nathaniel Gray, arrived on June 18, 1872. His notes, preserved in the Chatham County Register, describe chemical glassware of Continental, design and an arrangement of polished mirrors used perhaps for medical or optical study. Gray concluded the sisters may have pursued crude galvanic experiments, an idea not unfamiliar after the war, when many tried to revive lost sciences amid the ruins. He even referenced older hospital methods described in Georgia in the American Civil War records, crude attempts to stimulate dead tissue using electricity. But Gray's interest ended abruptly. His final entry on the matter reads, "Unwise to continue examination. There are things in that place better left to rest." Within months, Carr sold the property at a loss and relocated inland. The years that followed blurred the truth further. Local children spoke of a woman in mourning attire seen near the riverbank at dawn, her veil soaked, her reflection absent in the water. A few claimed to hear singing from the direction of the old house, a fragile, wavering tone, as if three voices blended in one. No one could ever prove these stories. By 1880, fires had consumed half of the abandoned structure. The county surveyor, noting the ruin in his report, described blackened beams that smelled faintly of medicine and resin. Among the ashes, he found a single silver brooch engraved with the initials LM. It was catalogued briefly, then lost when the courthouse records burned in 1892. Even decades later, physicians studying the region's strange medical folklore mentioned the Miller phenomenon, a local shorthand for unexplained resuscitation attempts, often whispered about by doctors who feared ridicule. These anecdotes, though unverified, resurfaced in later reviews of Southern post-war medicine, again echoing the archives of Georgia in the American Civil War, which detailed how desperation had blurred the lines between science and the supernatural during those years. To this day, the marsh east of Savannah remains strangely avoided. Travelers claim that at low tide, faint lights still shimmer where the Miller house once stood, blue, wavering and always just beyond reach. By 1881, Savannah's records spoke of the Miller estate as if it were an old wound, noted but never truly examined. The land had been sold twice, and yet each new owner abandoned it within months. The neighbors said it was the humidity or the soil, or perhaps just bad luck. Others muttered that the sisters' work had left something behind, something the tide could not wash away. It was that year when Professor Eliard Thorne of the University of Georgia took an interest in the property. A physician and amateur historian, Thorne specialized in the Reconstruction-era aftermath of Southern medicine. His papers, later archived alongside the documents cited in Georgia in the American Civil War, mentioned a certain household east of Savannah, long associated with chemical study and grave rumor. Thorne arrived that April, accompanied by a small team of students. In his field journal, he described the ruins, collapsed beams, remnants of glass embedded in the earth, and a foundation blackened as though scorched from beneath. What struck him most were the traces of writing etched into a surviving wall. Delicate Latin script reading, "Non omnis moriar," I shall not wholly die. One of his assistants, a young man named Willis Hanford, later wrote that the professor kept one of the jars they uncovered. Inside, he said, was a colorless liquid that moved slightly when no one stirred it. Thorne dismissed the boy's unease, labeling it air pressure trapped under the seal. Still, Hanford resigned a week later and refused to speak of the expedition again. That same summer, newspapers ran short blurbs about the haunted ruin east of Savannah. The Augusta Chronicle published a brief editorial claiming locals had heard feminine laughter drifting over the marsh, dismissed, of course, as superstition. Yet an anonymous letter to the editor suggested the phenomenon was connected to galvanic trials, once conducted by the Miller women, comparing it to older Confederate experiments with nerve response and suspended animation, again echoing fragments from Georgia in the American Civil War archives. In 1883, Thorne published his essay, The Border Between Life and Function, wherein he hinted that certain lost practitioners of the late Confederacy had pursued forbidden continuities between physiology and soul. His work caused brief controversy in academic circles but was quietly withdrawn after an unexplained fire destroyed his notes. The following year, by the late 1880s, the marsh reclaimed what remained of the Miller house. Locals said that when the fog... By 1890, the Miller case had drifted into the quiet corners of courthouse memory. No one alive could remember seeing the sisters after 1868, yet their absence continued to produce shadows. The Chatham County Archives held thin folders labeled Property, Miller and Unresolved Estate, East Marsh District. Inside were little more than ink-blotted deeds, receipts for medical glassware, and a final tax record listing the property as abandoned, unsuitable for habitation. Still, the story refused to die. A traveling journalist named Edwin Marbury arrived in Savannah that summer, collecting material for a series on Southern mysteries. His notes, rediscovered decades later, describe an eerie visit to the overgrown ruins. I saw, he wrote, what appeared to be a child's shoe half buried near the brick threshold, and beside it a rusted key unlike any local make. The air was heavy with a smell of salt and iron. Marbury sought out Dr. Nathaniel Gray, by then an elderly man living in a boarding house near Liberty Street. The doctor, who had once inspected the sisters' home, declined to speak on record, but whispered one thing as Marbury left. Whatever they found it in themselves first. By this time, Savannah's physicians had become accustomed to odd inquiries. Medical students occasionally asked about the Miller process, believing it was some forgotten surgical technique. Professors denied any such method existed. Yet in the attic of the old medical college, a janitor uncovered a thin notebook stamped Private L.M. It contained only sketches of faces, serene, unblinking, half-finished, each signed with the same phrase, non omnis moria. Local church records note that around 1892, Reverend Barrow, nephew of the earlier Reverend Barlow, performed a quiet ceremony at the overgrown property. The entry reads simply, 3 stones set. No names, no dates. It is the last official acknowledgement of the site before it was erased from county maps. That same year, the courthouse fire destroyed many Reconstruction-era documents. In the ashes, librarians later found fragments of charred pages referencing Georgia in the American Civil War, the same source that had mentioned Dr. Alaric Wayne and his wartime experiments. The coincidence revived brief academic curiosity, but was quickly forgotten amid more pressing concerns of a growing city. By 1895, the story had drifted from newsprint to whisper. Children walking home from school would dare each other to call the sisters' names across the marsh. Emma, Catherine, Lillian. They'd shout and listen for the echo. Some swore they heard a faint reply, not loud, not even distinct, but enough to make them run. As the century turned, the Miller name lingered like a watermark beneath Savannah's surface. Historians noted that no burial records, no verified portraits, and no living relatives were ever found. What remained was rumor, record fragments, and the uneasy memory of 3 women who had tested the line between medicine and mystery. By 1898, Savannah had changed. Rail lines hummed, electric lights flickered along the riverfront, and the city tried to forget its older ghosts. Yet in the marshlands east of town, the past refused to be buried. The Miller property remained untouched, a stretch of sunken ground choked with reeds, where locals said the soil itself breathed when the tide was high. A new generation knew the story only in fragments. Children whispered it during storms. 3 sisters who spoke with lightning. A house that hummed. Their parents told them not to repeat such things, but even the grown folk would make the sign of the cross when passing near the bend after dark. One autumn, an amateur photographer named Harold Winslow, known for his fascination with the supernatural, set out to capture what he called evidence of the Savannah haunting. His journal, later found in a pawnshop trunk, describes how he reached the site at dusk. "I saw only mud and reeds," he wrote, "yet when I placed the lens toward the horizon, 3 faint figures appeared in the reflection of the glass plate before I exposed it. He fled before finishing the photograph, and when the negative was developed days later, it showed only streaks of light across the marsh, long, twisting shapes that resembled silhouettes." A historian from Atlanta, Mrs. Eleanor McCrae, wrote a short article that same year for Southern Folklore Quarterly. She traced the legend back to wartime medicine, referencing the same Georgia in the American Civil War documents that had recorded Confederate doctors' experiments with electricity and suspended life. McCrae proposed that the Miller sisters may have been assistants in such work and continued it privately after the war. Her conclusion was mild, but her readers found the suggestion deeply unsettling. Soon after her article, a local archivist named Preston Lane attempted to recover the sisters' court records. He noted that the pages concerning their estate had been replaced twice, newer sheets copied in unfamiliar handwriting. The signatures, though written decades apart, appeared identical. Lane's assistant resigned after that discovery, claiming to have heard tapping noises in the archive vault at night, 3 precise knocks always spaced the same. Lane himself died in 1901 of what newspapers called a sudden affliction of the heart. That winter, residents near the marsh began reporting pale lights again, moving across the fog like lanterns in procession. One ferryman, interviewed by the Savannah Tribune, said he saw 3 ladies dressed in mourning on the shore. though his passenger insisted the beach was empty. Over time, the city built levees and railways, erasing the geography that had once held the Miller estate. But even as new maps replaced old ones, the name Miller Creek appeared quietly on several surveys, though no such creek officially existed. It was as if the land itself refused to forget. By the turn of the century, 1902 to be precise, Savannah's fascination with the Miller case had settled into the half-believed realm of local superstition. The younger generation spoke of it the way one speaks of a half-remembered dream, knowing the shape, forgetting the details. Yet among archivists and medical scholars, the case refused to rest. At the Georgia State Medical Association's spring conference that year, a paper was quietly circulated titled Residual Phenomena in Post-Mortem Electrical Reactions. Its author, signing only as CM, claimed that certain tissues could retain reflexive vitality long after death, provided they were treated with a specific compound. Though the document was unsigned, several attendees noted that the handwriting bore uncanny resemblance to letters attributed to the middle Miller sister, Catherine. The text even referenced a Confederate physician once stationed in Savannah, almost certainly Dr. Alaric Wayne, whose name appears in Georgia in the American Civil War archives. The association refused to publish the paper formally, calling it too speculative and morally ambiguous, but word of it spread among private circles. Within months, collectors and amateur scientists began arriving quietly in Savannah, asking about the Miller manuscripts. No one ever admitted to finding them. Meanwhile, fishermen and levee workers told stories of odd disturbances along the river. Nets drawn from the water came up tangled with black filaments, like hair. Some claimed that when they burned the strands, they emitted a faint metallic scent, as though soaked in ether. That same year, an old man named Caleb Timmons, the former delivery boy who had once brought supplies to the Miller sisters, gave a short, trembling statement to a visiting journalist. "I never forgot that sound," he said. "The humming. When I close my eyes, I still hear it. It's like they left something running that never stopped." In 1905, the county commissioned surveyors to clear and map the marshlands for expansion. One worker, Samuel Lyle, reported striking something metallic beneath a thin layer of clay. The object was circular, no larger than a plate engraved with interlocking triangles. He said it vibrated faintly when touched, though no one else witnessed it. 2 days later, Lyle fell ill with fever and was sent home. He never returned. When his belongings were gathered from the worksite, the metal disc was missing. The foreman later claimed to have heard a low tone, like wind blowing through a bottle, near the spot where it had been unearthed. For the next decade, the marsh remained quiet. The city grew westward. By 1907, Savannah had become a different city. Trolley lines buzzed. Steamboats whistled along the river, and yet the marsh east of town remained untouched, avoided as though it were consecrated to silence. Even the developers who dreamed of laying tracks there abandoned the plan after survey poles sank overnight into the mud. Their tops swallowed whole by dawn. Among the remaining residents who remembered the old world, one name still carried weight: Miller. Not in court records or directories, but in whispers traded by nurses, undertakers, and aging doctors who had seen too much. They called it the Miller effect, a phrase used when a patient revived briefly after death only to relapse seconds later. It was not a clinical term, yet it appeared in margin notes of at least 3 medical reports from the era. In 1908, a physician named Dr. Hollis Brand, newly arrived from Charleston, wrote a curious letter to the editor of the Savannah Evening Press. He had examined a patient suffering from sudden catatonia who, upon recovery, spoke of 3 women waiting in the light behind the window. Brand dismissed it as delirium. But what troubled him was that the patient later produced a phrase in Latin, non omnis moria. When Brand looked it up, he found the same inscription recorded decades earlier, on the wall of the Miller house ruins. Cited in Thorne's Forgotten Field Journal, this discovery renewed the curiosity of a few academics who had once studied wartime medicine. Among them was Professor Marcellus Kent, who returned to the Georgia archives to investigate the case. His surviving correspondence notes that he had reviewed Georgia in the American Civil War material for connections between Confederate hospitals and a Dr. A. Wayne of Savannah, and 3 unnamed assistants of feminine origin. The phrasing suggested he suspected the sisters had been involved in Wayne's medical experiments. Before the city's fall, Kent's letters stop abruptly in December of that same year. A student later wrote that he had gone to the marsh to see the lights for himself. His horse returned at dawn without him, the saddle wet with river water. The sheriff's search found nothing but fragments, 1 boot, a lantern half buried in the reeds, and a torn scrap of cloth stitched with delicate black thread. When held to the light, the stitching revealed a faint symbol, 2 interlocking triangles crossed by a serpent. For a time, the local press revived the Miller story. Editorials speculated about mesmerism, hypnotic trances, or even chemical illusions left in the soil. But within a month, the tension faded again. Savannah's people had learned that some mysteries could not be solved, only endured. By 1910, when the new river embankment was built, the last remnants of the Miller estate were buried beneath tons of clay. The engineers reported hearing odd vibrations through the pile drivers, as if the ground itself were humming. They finished the work quickly and left without ceremony. But to this day, boatmen claim that when the tide turns just before dawn, you can still see faint ripples spreading outward from the exact spot, 3 at a time, perfectly spaced, as if something beneath still remembers the sisters' rhythm. By 1911, the marsh east of Savannah had been almost entirely reclaimed by the river. The new embankment road ended abruptly where the water line began, and the old locals said that was precisely where the Miller house once stood. Few cared to argue. Time had buried the truth, and the city preferred progress over ghosts. Still, a handful of aging residents clung to the story. One was Mrs. Abigail Crow, once a housekeeper to the family in her youth, now blind and living in a small cottage on Tybee Island. When interviewed by a newspaper columnist, she spoke softly of Miss Lillian, the quiet one, and how she never raised her eyes but heard everything. Crow claimed that one summer evening, long before the disappearance, she had seen the sisters gathered around a table in the parlor, their hands joined over a small brass plate that emitted a faint light. "They said it was to speak with the body," she murmured, "but I knew they meant the spirit." Her account, printed in the Savannah Herald, was dismissed as senile fancy. Yet the reporter's editor added a footnote, suggesting that Crow's memory aligned with certain wartime experiments recorded in Georgia in the American Civil War, particularly those conducted by Confederate surgeons studying neural excitation through galvanic charge. The parallel reignited brief local curiosity, but not for long. Later that same year, a dredging crew expanding the river channel uncovered fragments of glass and brass near the old coordinates of the Miller property. The foreman described them as laboratory remains, though several pieces were melted into forms no one could identify. One worker pocketed a small metal loop etched with Latin letters, only to return it days later after claiming it moved when held in his palm. By 1913, an unseasonal flood covered the area once again. The water rose higher than any in living memory, cutting off the lowlands for weeks. When it finally receded, no trace of the Miller ruins could be found, only a smooth stretch of silt glimmering faintly under moonlight. A few years later, in 1915, the centennial issue of the Savannah Morning News ran a retrospective piece on unsolved legends of the South. The Miller sisters occupied a single column near the end, described as reclusive scholars of disputed repute. The author, careful to separate fact from fable, concluded with a sentence that lingered longer than intended. In Savannah's memory, they remain suspended between science and prayer, between what is proven and what must be left to silence. After that, the story of the Miller sisters slipped beneath the surface of official history. The land became part of the river's shifting edge. Only the old maps, with faint pencil marks and erased notations, hinted that something once stood there, something that made the air hum long after the wind had gone still. And even now, boatmen whisper that when fog rises before dawn, 3 ripples break the water in perfect rhythm, like breaths, faint but certain just below the tide. By 1916, Savannah's skyline shimmered with new ambition, shipyards rebuilt, factories rising, the world edging toward war again. Yet among the older generation, conversations sometimes drifted back to the strange case of the Miller sisters. the last story of the old century that still made candles gutter when mentioned aloud. A local historian, Jonathan Rees, began gathering accounts of the city's unwritten histories. He visited former servants, parish records, and aging war veterans who still remembered the first rumors from 1865. His unpublished notes, now preserved in a private collection, describe his visits to the site where the sisters' home once stood. "The ground is uneven," he wrote, "and the air hums faintly when pressed by the ear, as though something beneath remembers the charge of long ago." Rees corresponded with a northern academic who specialized in post-war Reconstruction medicine. Their letters often mentioned Georgia in the American Civil War, which had become the definitive reference for understanding Savannah's role in wartime science. In one exchange, the professor warned that certain unverified local practices were better left unexamined, particularly those involving galvanic experiments rumored to revive tissue after death. Rees ignored the advice. In April 1916, he returned to the marsh with a young photographer. The pair set up a small plate camera on the embankment and took 4 exposures of the river at low tide. The photographer, an apprentice named James Corby, later testified that during the 3rd shot, Rees asked him to stop and listen. "It's there," Rees whispered. "Do you hear it?" The tone? Corby heard only wind. When the photographs were developed that evening, 3 faint shapes appeared in the 3rd frame, blurred, elongated, and aligned like figures walking toward the water. Rees called it a light reflection. Corby quit the next day and never handled a camera again. That summer, Savannah's archives recorded a minor tremor near the river bend. Newspapers called it a localized settling of the soil, though a few claimed to have seen a brief flash above the water that night, blue-white, like distant lightning. No damage was reported, but the vibration rattled window panes as far inland as Victory Drive. Rees died 2 years later in 1918, having published nothing. His sister, who inherited his papers, noted one unfinished sentence in his final journal entry. The sisters were not chasing life, they were preserving what refused to end. When her home flooded in 1920, nearly all of Rees's writings were destroyed. Only one page survived, pressed between warped boards, a faint sketch of 3 women standing shoulder to shoulder, their outlines blurred by what looked like ripples in water. Even now, when fog drifts over the marsh east of Savannah, the boatmen who know the old stories refuse to linger. They say the air hums softly just before dawn, 3 notes rising and falling, like voices trying still to finish. By 1917, Savannah's port bustled again, filled with the noise of new war contracts and soldiers preparing to ship overseas. Yet in quiet corners of the city, the reading rooms, the rectories, the medical wards, the older residents still whispered the name Miller. To them it was not quite folklore, not quite science. But something caught between both. Dr. Hollis Brand, the same physician who had once written about a patient's strange Latin phrases, had taken to lecturing on cases of spontaneous muscular reanimation. His audience thought it theatrics, but his private notes hinted at something more troubling. In one margin he wrote, "No matter the patient's age or ailment, the pulse hums thrice before fading." He never mentioned the sisters directly, but his students called such moments Miller echoes. The city archives, reorganized that spring, briefly reopened the old Chatham County property rolls. Among the damaged ledgers, clerks found the Miller deed as a brittle, nearly dust, and beneath it an unsigned note that read simply, "Return to the river. They wait below." The handwriting was identical to Catherine Miller's known correspondence. A reporter from the Savannah Tribune pursued the rediscovery, printing a column titled, "The Sisters Beneath the Clay." He visited the site with a photographer at low tide, finding only driftwood and weeds. Yet when the photograph was developed, a faint white band appeared across the center. 3 pale forms blurred together, like reflections caught mid-movement. The editor dismissed it as a shutter error. Meanwhile, archivists cross-referenced the handwriting with surviving war-era documents, including those cited in Georgia in the American Civil War. A Confederate field ledger listed 3 unnamed assistants who worked under Dr. Alaric Wayne between 1863 and 1864, 2 from Savannah, 1 of uncertain origin. The notation stopped abruptly after December 1864, the month Sherman entered the city. Historians later suggested those assistants vanished with the retreating staff, though no names were ever confirmed. By the close of that year, rainstorms flooded the eastern marsh again. For 3 consecutive nights, watchmen on the riverboats reported flashes over the water, bluish-white and low, as though drawn from beneath. The Morning News published a single line the next morning. Residents east of town note unusual light phenomena, believed to be phosphorescence. When peace returned the following spring, the matter faded once more. Savannah had seen too much of death to dwell on ghosts. But even as the modern age advanced, electric lamps, glowing where candlelight once flickered, there remained a small unease whenever fog rose from the river at dawn. Older dockhands would cross themselves and say softly, "It's them again, the sisters taking measure of the tide." And if one listened closely, beneath the hum of the ships and the cry of the gulls, there came a sound too faint to name. 3 pulses steady as breath, rising and falling with the water. By 1918, Savannah found itself divided between 2 worlds, the modern and the remembered. The city, with its new electric grids and hospital wards, looked forward to the coming century. But the marsh east of the river remained as it always had, silent, heavy, and faintly uneasy. Old fishermen still told the story to their sons, mostly as a warning not to wander too far past the levee. "There's a current that don't belong to the river," one of them said, "and it pulls toward the place where the house once stood." Few took him seriously, though many who laughed returned home uneasy after dusk. That winter, a flood exposed what appeared to be wooden pilings from the original Miller Foundation. City engineers examined them before another storm washed the remnants away. In their report, they described an unusual metallic residue embedded in the grain, like iron but warm to the touch. No sample was preserved. The workers refused to carry it. A small notice appeared in the Savannah Morning News in early 1919. Excavation near East Marsh reveals structural debris of unknown composition. Believed to be remnants of Miller property, long since vanished. The article ran only once, then disappeared from the archive microfilms years later, likely misplaced or removed. Around the same time, an elderly cleric named Reverend Avery Barlow, grandson of the first minister who'd visited the sisters, gave a sermon at St. John's, church titled On the Folly of Defying Sleep. The congregation remembered it not for theology but for one strange passage. "The body may rest, but the mind will walk until it is called back. 3 souls try to walk forever, and the water keeps their rhythm." When questioned later, Barlow only smiled and said, "That's an old story. Fair's left where the river keeps it." In 1920, the Georgia Historical Review published a final retrospective on the city's lesser-known Reconstruction legends. The Miller case received half a page, no names, only initials, summarized as 3 sisters who pursued galvanics. Resurrection beyond reason. The editor cited Georgia in the American Civil War as the earliest verified mention of their involvement in wartime science, and closed with a line that felt almost like an epitaph. Whatever they sought in life, they have found in the stillness beneath Savannah. After that, the name vanished from academic papers. The site became part of a wildlife reserve, closed to public access. Maps stopped marking the inlet, though fishermen still know the curve of water where fog seems thicker. Sound travels slower, and the air carries that faint, impossible hum. Even now, those who navigate the marsh at dawn say the current there moves differently, steady, rhythmic, and patient. 3 slow pulses, as though the tide itself remembers something buried deep and refuses, even after half a century, to let it rest. By 1921, Savannah's marshlands had all but swallowed the last trace of the Miller estate. The levees stood higher now, the tides regulated, and yet the air over that stretch of river carried a peculiar hum that no one could explain. To newcomers, it was only the sound of wind and water. To the old ones, it was memory. 3 long, even pulses fading into the reeds. A group of university students, inspired by their professor's fascination with local lore, decided to investigate. They were led by Miss Eleanor Jameson, a scholar of postbellum history known for her work, comparing regional myths to archival evidence. She had studied the sisters' story for years and even cited Georgia in the American Civil Society, wore in her lectures to explain the blurred boundary between Confederate medical research and what people later called superstition. The students arrived by boat one October evening, carrying lanterns and notebooks. Jameson's diary, one of the few surviving records of the trip, describes the night as still and dry, the air smelling faintly of copper. They found nothing at first, just the faint shimmer of phosphorescent water and reeds that bowed as if under invisible weight. Then, as the tide began to turn, one of the students noticed the light from his lantern reflecting in triplicate. 3 distinct gleams in the water, equally spaced and perfectly still. Thinking it a trick of the current, he waded closer. The lights did not move. When he dipped his hand beneath the surface, the water felt warm. Moments later, the lantern flame fluttered violently and went out. The group fled back to their boat, leaving their equipment behind. In her report, Jameson wrote, "I have no explanation, only that the marsh gave sound as we left, not the cry of birds or wind, but a soft, measured resonance like a breath held too long." She never published her findings, though fragments of her notes appear in the 1923 Georgia Folklore Register. There she referred to the phenomenon as the triad echo, describing it as a sound of unknown origin associated with the East Marsh of Savannah, recurring during low tide. Later writers would link this entry to the Miller legend, suggesting that the echo marked the sisters' resting place, or perhaps the persistence of their work. By the mid-1920s, the site was inaccessible except by small boat. The city expanded westward, and the marsh became a memory kept alive only by fishermen and night watchmen. Yet the river itself seemed unwilling to forget. Even now, old captains claim that when fog settles heavy before sunrise, 3 ripples cross the water in unison, calm, steady, and deliberate, as though time itself were breathing beneath the surface. By 1926, Savannah had grown restless with its own past. The roaring years brought music, electricity, and noise, yet the silence of the eastern marsh remained untouched, the one part of the city no one dared to tame. Locals said the fog there fell differently, in clean vertical curtains instead of soft drifts, and when the tide turned, it carried with it a vibration like a pulse hidden beneath the water. Old sailors called it the Miller tide. They spoke of it half jokingly, half in reverence. 3 ripples moving together, always at the same distance apart. No one had ever measured them. No one wanted to. That summer, an engineer named Thomas Kittredge arrived from Atlanta to survey new canal routes. Educated and skeptical, he dismissed the stories as fishermen's talk. His correspondence to the Savannah City Works Department, still preserved in the archives, reads, "Local men avoid the eastern marsh for reasons unscientific. I shall complete my survey there personally." On August 4th, Kittredge and his 2 assistants entered the marsh at dawn. By noon, only one of them returned. The survivor, a laborer named Lang, described the air as so thick it hummed. He claimed the reeds bent away as they walked, as if something beneath them was breathing. Then, he said, there was a sudden stillness. No birds, no wind, no sound, except the water whispering 3 beats together. Kittredge's notebook was later found half buried in silt. Its last legible line read, "No current, yet vibration persists. Rhythm constant, he was never seen again." The report was quietly filed as accidental drowning. The following month, an anonymous letter reached the Savannah Chronicle. It was written in a tight, feminine hand and signed only L. The letter read, "You cannot bury resonance. It moves through matter as thought moves through flesh. We learned this once long ago, when medicine still listened to the living after they had gone. The editor dismissed it as a hoax, but the city never forgot it." Later, scholars noted that Kittredge's disappearance coincided with a brief resurgence of academic interest in the Civil War-era sciences. Mentioned in Georgia in the American Civil War, especially experiments in neural conduction and preservation. Some believed the letter's author possessed knowledge of those same methods, or perhaps was their last witness. After that, the marsh was fenced off entirely. Locals said the engineers built the barrier not for safety, but for silence. And when fog rolled in off the river, it pulled against that fence like a living thing. trembling faintly, as though keeping time with a rhythm no one else could hear. Even now, old captains crossing the Savannah River swear that if you cut your engines and listen long enough, you can still hear it. 3 soft pulses beneath the current, patient and precise, as though the sisters are still waiting for their next breath. By 1928, the marsh was marked on no official map. The fence that surrounded it had rusted, half swallowed by vines, but no one dared cross it. The city expanded in every direction except that one. Savannah, in its quiet wisdom, had learned where not to dig. In May of that year, the Chatham Historical Society held a small gathering in the library's upper hall to discuss vanished properties of post-war Georgia. Among the attendees was a visiting scholar, Dr. Eloise Randall, who had written extensively about women in early Southern science. Her presentation included a brief mention of the Miller sisters. She called them an unrecorded footnote in Savannah's intellectual history, and for a moment, the room fell utterly still. Randall explained that her research traced their names to several surviving documents in wartime medical ledgers and, she added, to faint mentions within the field notes of Georgia in the American Civil War, specifically those concerning hospital laboratories near the riverfront. According to her, the sisters' work blurred the border between anatomy and belief. The phrase unsettled the audience, and no one asked questions afterward. That night, Randall returned to her boarding house and wrote in her diary, "I believe they did not perish. They transitioned, not into death but into vibration, into the pulse that moves through the city's foundation. Every clock, every current, every heartbeat carries them." Her diary ended there. She vanished the following week. Her room was left unlocked, her suitcase neatly packed. On the table beside her notes was a small glass jar containing nothing but clear water, and 3 faint concentric ripples pressed into its surface, as though caught mid-motion. After her disappearance, the marsh was spoken of rarely, and then only in whispers. But the city had begun to change in subtle ways. Telegraph lines near the Eastern District sometimes pulsed irregularly, sending ghost signals with no discernible source. Dock workers claimed their lanterns flickered in unison, 3 quick flashes, then silence. The newspapers stopped printing such oddities, though the stories persisted in taverns and river shanties. In the late autumn of that year, one fisherman told a story that spread quietly through the port. "The water sings now," he said, "like 3 women humming under the tide." When asked if he believed it was real, he answered, "I don't know what's real anymore, but the river remembers." Even decades later, when engineers built the newer flood barriers, they found the ground beneath that stretch of river oddly stable, as though something beneath held it firm. The foreman remarked, "It's like the earth's heartbeat stronger here." And perhaps that is the legacy the city inherited, not tragedy, but a rhythm that never ceased. The Miller sisters may have vanished, but their resonance remained woven into the current, the tide, the low hum of Savannah itself. By 1930, Savannah had long since moved on. The marshlands where the Miller sisters once lived were overgrown, then drained and finally reclaimed by the river. The maps stopped naming the bend. Developers forgot it existed. But the river never forgot. Those who worked the early morning ferries swore that the eastern fog carried a low hum, 3 soft tones rising and falling with the tide, too even to be wind, too alive to be machine. When asked, they only said, "That's the old current talking. Best not to listen too long." In that same year, a young historian, Samuel Denton, compiled an unpublished manuscript titled Residual Phenomena of the Savannah Marsh. He described the Miller legend as the most persistent echo of Reconstruction era mystery. His closing note paraphrased a line from Georgia in the American Civil War, the same volume that had framed so much of the sisters' world. In war we learned the body could be broken, and in peace we learned that memory cannot be buried. Denton wrote that this was what the sisters embodied, not malice, not madness, but the yearning to preserve what refused to die. He died before finishing his work. The manuscript was never printed, though fragments remain in the university archive. Drawings of 3 concentric circles, an old house half submerged, and beneath it, a single phrase in Latin, non omnis moria. By the end of that decade, even the oldest residents could no longer recall precise details of the sisters' faces. Some said one had dark eyes, Others swore she was blind in one. Their story had become part of Savannah's bloodstream. Not history, but inheritance. When fog covers the river now, the city grows unusually quiet. The lamps burn softer, the gulls circle higher, and the sound of water changes. A deeper note, measured and patient, like a pulse moving through stone. Boatmen crossing at dawn often stop their engines just to listen. They say that for a few seconds the tide seems to breathe, and if you close your eyes you can almost hear voices beneath it. 3, in perfect harmony. No graves were ever found. No proof was ever given. But the story endures, told in low tones along the docks, in the libraries where the old ledgers still hum faintly when touched, and in the quiet rhythm of the water that surrounds Savannah. Perhaps the sisters were not lost at all. Perhaps they became part of the current, part of the vibration that never fades. And if you ever walk the marsh at sunrise and the fog thickens around you, if you hear the faintest pulse beneath your feet, steady and slow, remember this. Some echoes are not meant to fade. They simply wait beneath the tide for someone willing to listen.